Welcome back to Fresh Faces. Last time, we successfully raised over $6,400 for Project Hope's Ukraine Fund, which equipped Ukrainian facilities with medical equipment and hygiene kits. Despite our community's incredibly generous efforts, unfortunately, the situation has not improved. Fast forward to today, the civilian death count now well exceeds 10,000, with nearly 18,000 more of them wounded. And these are just the confirmed cases. The true number has become impossible to determine, a statement that should make anyone's heart sink. Last year, I told you that I felt personally responsible to help Ukrainian civilians due to my parents immigrating out of Russia. I am privileged. Had my parents raised me in Russia, I would be of prime age to be sent to my death over a glory I would have never experienced nor understood, like many young Russians today. I tried to communicate the severity of the tragedy of the Russo-Ukrainian War by saying this.
But the death toll as of early 2022, as a result of this conflict, was 14,200 people. 1 in 4 of those people who died were innocent civilians, and 437 of them were children, many of whom were killed in their homes because their apartment buildings were bombarded. It pains me to an incredible degree knowing that there are children who have to, instead of worrying about bullies and homework, they're worrying if their apartment is going to be there the next day.
While all of this is true, these statements don't do the situation justice. This time, I'm leaving no stone unturned. You'll be hearing from 2 prominent figures leading the charge to help the Ukrainian civilians, which is to help those who contributed nothing to the conflict and came out the most negatively impacted victims. They will be able to tell you the real story of what's been happening to the typical Ukrainian civilians. February 24th, 2022. The day that marks the start of Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine. That adjective, full-scale, is important because Russia had been instigating violence with Ukraine for a long time now. In 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych refused to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, displaying his support of a more Russia-associated future for Ukraine. After Yanukovych fled to Russia ahead of his impeachment, the eastern regions of Ukraine showed heavy support for Yanukovych, while the rest of the country approved of a more EU-associated future. The divide in the country was real, but it was a challenge that the Ukrainian nation was to deal with as a sovereign nation. However, in 2014, Russia just annexed Crimea and invaded Amvrosivka, which ultimately led to the war in Donbass, entirely for the purpose of influencing developments in Ukraine and halting any discussion of EU-Ukraine relations. Their aim was to turn Ukraine into a federal state, allowing Russia to have more influence in the eastern regions of Ukraine, obviously harming the unity and the sovereignty of Ukraine. During this time, there were roughly 14,000 casualties, 3,400 of them, nearly 25%, being innocent civilians. Among the civilian deaths was Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which was flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. A group of Russian separatists shot down an innocent passenger plane that had nothing to do with the conflict. It's clear to all that Putin successfully manufactured a crisis by lying to people about the threat that a sovereign and democratic Ukraine with ties to the Western world would pose to Russia. The truth was, that threat was non-existent. The talks of Ukraine joining with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known more commonly as NATO, was simply the final excuse that Putin needed. Putin claimed that this merited a special military operation with the aim of protection of people. It was all a facade to justify what has become the most tragic event in Ukraine's history. Most of the media coverage of the full-scale invasion is about the military support that is provided to Ukraine and, unfortunately, if it's worth it. Ukraine is in desperate need of weapons out of a necessity for self-defense. Putin has made it clear nearly 2 years later that Russia is not entertaining any peace discussion until their goals are met. President Zelensky has implored for assistance in military aid for self-defense. Zelensky's persistent pleas are completely understandable when we take a look beyond the big picture and actually analyze who the real victims are. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, over 100,000 Russian soldiers and tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have died. However, the most tragic part is that the Russian military has killed over 10,000 innocent Ukrainian civilians, with 461 children dying during the first year of the full-scale invasion. It is haunting to attempt to extrapolate that number to the present. The number is likely well over 500. When you recognize that the Russian government has specifically targeted innocent civilians with their attacks, it becomes crystal clear that the Russian government is the one causing conflict, not solving it. Among the affected civilians are families who have lost loved ones, women who were raped and beaten by Russian soldiers, and innocent people tortured by the Russian military. Every single Ukrainian has suffered at the hands of Putin and the Russian military. Among the Ukrainians affected is Dr. Roman Sheremeta.
My name is Roman Sheremeta. I have right now hold three positions. First of all, I am a founding rector of American University Kyiv. We founded an American university in Kyiv during the time of war. Also, I'm a professor at Case Western Reserve University, and I was for some time on leave of absence there to do some work in Ukraine. Now I'm moving back to the United States. And also, I am a chair of Ukrainian American House, which is NGO that has been working for quite a few years, but more intensely so over the past 2 years, bringing humanitarian aid and just helping refugees, trying to make Ukrainian people's life more bearable, let's say that.
Dr. Roman Sheremeta has been crucial for restorative efforts in the Ukrainian communities, and despite being a leader in Ukraine, his involvement in loss have been incredibly personal.
So the first 2 weeks of the full-scale invasion, I would say I had a depression. You know, I had a very, very heavy heart. It was just trying to do anything humanly possible to help my family. I have 3 family members who are on the front lines right now. About 1 month ago, one of my family members, he's a cousin of mine, Taras. He was hit by the Russian drone, miraculously survived. He crawled back to his positions over 1 mile. He shouted to his comrade saying help, and then he passed out, and he remembers when he woke up in the hospital 300 miles away from the front line. So this is how it affected me personally. It affects me very deeply on emotional level, on personal level, physically, because of my relatives. I lost 3 friends already in the war. My parents are in Ukraine, my brother, my sister-in-law. So I do, you know, I do get involved very personal. I'll be back in Ukraine in next month. So, you know, very well involved.
Roman's story is one out of the millions that exist in Ukraine of suffering and loss. Even though for many it seems all hope is lost, resilience and hope is the only thing left for some of the civilians.
The story that that I probably will share is the story of my colleague Anna Shvindina. She is the faculty, one of the first people that I hired at the university. So this is the beginning of war, full-scale invasion, 2022. We're talking about February, late February. Anna's city is completely surrounded. It's a city called Sumy. You can check it on the map. It was completely surrounded by Russians. Anna was hiding in the basement because the city was constantly shelled. You know, her life was in constant threat, and she could not leave the city because of the 2 parents who were handicapped. And so she was taking care of them in the basement. And I remember just telling her, "Hey, Anna, you know, just let me know how I can help you, you know, let me know if you can get out of there." And she is telling me, like, you know, and I'm crying as I'm writing this message. This is like, you know, one of my first hires, my friend, becoming friend, faculty. And she's like, "Roman, you know what? I think everything is going to be fine. And you know, everything is going to be Ukraine. We will survive this. You know, and even if we don't, I still know that everything is going to be fine." And she, the fact that, you know, this lady in the middle of such a horrific circumstances, her life is on the thread, she was the one comforting me.
This type of resilience and hope is nothing short of the world's largest stress test of the human spirit. And I am at least grateful that now, the hope now has a project in front of it. While the governments and media sources of the world discuss military aid and the global politics of the war, the stories of the Ukrainian civilians largely go unaddressed. The truth is, though, that while the governments have the means to provide the military support, humanitarian support requires a much more hands-on approach and doesn't require any escalation of conflict. Humanitarian aid provides assistance to the innocent bystanders without contributing to additional violence. When choosing organizations to support, it is critical to recall that the humanitarian aid Ukraine needs is two-pronged. The first prong provides assistance to those still residing in Ukraine.
First of all is to help direct humanitarian aid.
The second prong provides assistance to those who managed to flee Ukraine but left their entire lives behind. Imagine how much help you would need if you had to flee a country where you didn't speak the language or have any of your belongings with you.
Another one, we actually working with refugees, especially local refugees in the United States.
Project Hope accomplishes that goal and has been instrumental for providing humanitarian aid. We spoke with Evan Johnson, the Vice President of Fundraising for Project Hope, to find out how they're doing it.
I am Evan Johnson, and I am the Senior Director of Mass Market Fundraising at Project Hope. And so my role is focused on the general public and supporters of Project Hope and prospective donors to raise funds to support our global work. That includes the support for people in Ukraine. And as part of that, I also oversee our charities training program.
Project Hope hits both prongs, already having raised over $11 million to be distributed to both groups.
There is just a lot that people emotionally and mentally have to deal with, both working and people experiencing what's going on, which is why I'll talk about more, which is why we're not just focused on urgent medical needs and supplies and hygiene and repairing facilities. We're focused on mental health too. So we have a lot of mental health spaces throughout Ukraine and in with refugees, or throughout inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine.
Project Hope also recognizes that once the war hopefully ends, the demand for humanitarian support will persist, and Project Hope is ready to provide that support.
Should the war end tomorrow, the humanitarian situation is not going to be solved, right?
Right.
You're still going to have to recover, rebuild. You're still going to have to deal with mental support. You're still going to have urgent needs. All of that isn't going to go away, and we're set up to be able to continue to get funding, to continue to get donations and help them. And I think that's going to be even more important because it won't be in the media, and people won't. That's when support is truly going to make an even bigger difference, because it's going to be even harder to ask people to be aware of the needs.
It has been encouraging to witness that once the Ukrainian people receive aid, the first thing they want to do is turn around and help the people around them.
If you look at the data, a typical Ukrainian family is actually contributing almost twice as much to the American economy than the average American family. And the reason is because there is a lot of self-selection. People that come to the United States, they are already motivated.
One thing about Ukrainians is that when someone helps them, their way of saying thanks is by giving back. And so what that has also reflected in our work in Ukraine is Ukrainians themselves that we've helped. Once they've been helped, whether they come to get psychological support at a mental health center or they got medical support, many of them then have applied to work with Project Hope and help others. So we have actually videos of them sharing that. So a lot of our Ukrainians have actually been helped by Project Hope and then turned around and started to work for Project Hope to help others.
Project Hope operates entirely on donations, and so any contribution you can make is incredibly helpful, even if that's hard to believe. When the magnitude of the conflict is war, it's hard to see how contributing just a single dollar is ever going to move the needle for delivering effective aid. It's a concern I share and a question that I asked Evan.
One thing that Project Hope does is we purchase these very large emergency kits. They're called kits, but they're really gigantic, like shipments. IEHKs is what they're called, and they essentially provide enough supplies for. So if you break it down, that $1 is enough medical supplies for one person for 3 months, because of the nature of these large kits that we buy in the large shipment of bulk. So you can just, that's basically equates to 74 cents per person. So you can take any amount that you raise in this campaign even, divide it by 74 cents USD, and that's how many. That's an example. Like, it's not literally that's what you're doing, but that's an example of how impactful a donation can be. And you can just say, like, if that's how many people, it's the equivalent of how many people are getting emergency medical supplies.
Change happens with a collective effort, and a little bit from everybody helps bring innocent Ukrainian civilians back to a stable state.
The bottom line here is that the people in Ukraine that need aid are finally starting to get it. All of this is possible because of contributions from people like you to organizations like Project Hope. While I'm grateful that we get to be a part of these efforts, I don't just want to gloss over the amount that is irrevocably lost. I want to end this segment in a way that pays homage just to the regular civilians who lost their lives, and fortunately for those that made it, they still lost loved ones and quality of life. So I'd like to give the last word to someone who was born and raised in the Ukraine, went back to the Ukraine to help the country he knew and loved, experienced the bomb shelters like many other Ukrainian civilians, and suffered several personal losses as a result of this war. I asked Dr. Roman Sheremetyev if he could only have people remember one thing from watching this documentary, what would it be? Here's what he said.
We as humanity, we as people, we have witnessed some horrific stuff throughout the history. We said never again after what Germany has done in 1940s. And right now, we are reliving a similar story today on a different scale, in a different place, but it's a similar story where Russia is trying to basically erase Ukraine from the existence. It's a genocide of a sort. It's a genocide because the primary goal is to make sure that Ukraine doesn't exist as a nation. Now, we promised never again, and never again comes again. And so I just appeal to everybody around the world to stand on the right side of the history. 10, 20 years, 30, 40 years from now, those of us who will be living will be retelling the stories to our children, grandchildren, and we will say, you know what, this was a horrific war. It was a genocide, an attempt to genocide. But I stood with Ukraine. I stood on the right side of the history. And, I can proudly say that the nation has survived. And today, I just want to thank everyone who is standing on the right side of the history.